All right, welcome everyone to the 165th in the series of urban workshops that the Center for Policy Research and the Center for Science and Humanities, the French Center here in Delhi, co-host together. It's our pleasure this time to welcome Professor Arup Mitra, who teaches at the South Asian University. I think we've been having this conversation for quite some time to get him to present his work to us. This is a workshop, a series that deals with a broad set of urban issues from multiple disciplines. And I think it's after a while that we have an economist speaking. So, that's extra exciting. Arup is going to talk about barriers to employment. Before Arup was with South Asian University, he was professor of economics at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi, and has held a number of prestigious positions and visiting professorships across the world in Sciences Po in Paris, in ILO in Geneva, in Nagoya University in Japan, and so on. So he brings a very rich experience to us today, and we look forward to hearing from him. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, please feel free to write your question and answers either in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will take your queries and your comments on board once the presentation is over. So welcome again, Arup, and over to you.
And to share it again.
Yes, to share your screen.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts and research. In fact, this study I did for the World Bank, and it's a very large study. We have done it at the enterprise level, at the individual level, and also at the macro level. However, I will just present a couple of things, particularly at the macro level and from the individual unit level data. So the structure of the presentation will be as follows. Let me just briefly tell you about different viewpoints which have been highlighted in the literature as far as the barriers to employment is concerned. And then I will talk about some evidence at the macro level and go to the individual level before concluding and giving you the policy insights. We have seen in Kuznets' framework that there is a strong relationship between industrialization and urbanization, and this framework has been extended later to include the services sector as well. Most of the recent studies have been highlighting the fact that there is a sort of separation between the composition of value added and the changing composition of value added and the changing composition of the occupational structure, particularly in the Indian context. And this has been happening in many other developing countries also. In other words, to put it very bluntly, even if there is a structural transformation away from agriculture towards a non-agricultural sector in terms of value added, it is not really happening so in terms of occupational structure. So still agriculture comprises a very large percentage of the workforce, and the implications of such mismatches between value added composition and the workforce composition can be envisaged in terms of rising inequality, sluggish urbanization, engagement in low productivity employment, particularly in the urban informal sector, and also persistence of poverty. Of course, here we try to define poverty in a much larger sense and not really in terms of consumption poverty. So first of all, we are able to see that slow economic growth tends to reduce the employment generation, and particularly when we try to highlight the concept of inclusive growth. So we know that productive employment has to be generated for all sections of the population, those who are unskilled and semi-skilled and moderately skilled, and not just those who are highly skilled. So from that point of view, to what extent the urban areas and to what extent the aggregate economy, the non-farm sector in the aggregate economy is able to offer employment opportunities. So we try to bring out the rural non-farm sector and also the urban employment scenario. In fact, some of the studies had pointed out that the productivity growth in the manufacturing sector can be pretty high. And that is the reason why the manufacturing sector was supposed to take the lead. But that we have already seen that even if the value-added growth is taking place significantly in the industrial sector, the employment growth rate has not really picked up. You consider the regulated regime from 1970s to mid-80s, the employment growth was less than 3% per annum in the organized industry. Then again, between 84, 85 to 89, 90 or so, the employment growth was very sluggish. After the 90s, when the industrial value-added growth really picked up, until almost the financial crisis happened, the employment growth was again about 2%, 2.5% or so. So it's never been very, very impressive at all. Some of the studies in the recent past, they have highlighted a wide range of factors. Yes. Okay. The deficiencies in India's infrastructure, particularly in energy and transport sector, has been said to be a major hindrance to employment generation. Labor regulations, of course, have been said to be of great obstacles. The reservation policy, which primarily means that certain products are reserved for certain categories of industries, that has also resulted in sluggish employment growth, and the entire gamut of complex regulations which govern the entry and exit of firms, despite the industrial deregulation of the 80s and the reforms of the 90s. The credit market imperfections have also been pointed out that they are the major constraints. On the whole, we get to see that infrastructure inadequacy, product market regulations, energy shortage, and also the role of political factors, which tends to sort of reduce the delivery of services, and that has added to the misery. Some of the other studies had also pointed out that the infrastructure endowment is, they had considered, in fact, different types of infrastructure, the physical, financial, and social infrastructure. And in these studies, they pointed out that the social infrastructure plays a critical role in augmenting the total factor productivity growth. And because the total factor productivity growth is very sluggish due to the poor resource endowment, infrastructure endowment across states, there has been sluggish industrialization, and which has also led to very sluggish employment growth. Now, there is a major concern that new technology, whether it is domestically innovated or it is imported from the developed nations, is highly capital and skill intensive. So, so from that point of view, it is again going to generate very less employment opportunities for those who are unskilled and semi-skilled. In fact, Yugar and myself, we had reviewed about 200 studies in world development in 2017. So, and we were basically trying to identify the sectors and the type of countries where technology, the new technology particularly, is going to have a very adverse effect on employment generation. And we could point out that in the low-income countries, the problem is going to be very, very serious. And it is not so much in the developed nations. The effective rate of protection and other trade barriers have been reduced significantly. Yet, and therefore the import of technology has gone up, but this import of technology only in certain cases has resulted in spillover effects. And those spillover effects have also contributed to employment generation. But on an average, if we consider the aggregate manufacturing sector, it has not really contributed to the huge range of spillover around many industrial groups. And also it has not really created employment opportunities, particularly for the unskilled and semi-skilled variety of workers. UNIDO, of course, has been taking a very different viewpoint. It has been suggesting that if the will has been discovered in some part of the world, there is no need to rediscover the will in the developing countries. Rather, the developing countries could spend more resources on certain developmental purposes for poverty reduction, human capital formation, etc. instead of renovating those technologies again. So it is better for them to import the technology from the developed nations. However, several studies, including our empirical research, has shown, using the UNIDO data, has shown that such kind of import of technology creates a mismatch between the labor requirement as per the technology and the labor available within the domestic economy of the developing countries. So the rise in capital accumulation has occurred evidently, even in the labor-intensive industries, we get to see that the capital intensity has gone up tremendously. However, Marco Vivarelli's work is really path-breaking. And though he says that more empirical research would be required to verify these propositions, but his theoretical arguments are really exciting. And he has, thank you very much. And he has given a number of reasons that why the new dynamics of development, even the new technology, will be able to create employment significantly. And I'm not going into the details of each of his arguments. So basically, he tries to point out that there is nothing to worry about the new technology or the fourth industrial revolution. It can contribute significantly to employment creation because the new technology will reduce the price of the technology, and which will also reduce the price of many products. And therefore, the profitability of the firms is going to increase tremendously. And that will lead to many new products coming into the market. So it will give rise to product innovation also. So it may start from process innovation, but slowly it will get into the product innovation, and new products will have to be created, will have to be produced. They would also require the employment to be done. Now, as far as research and development expenditure is concerned, some of our study pointed out that firms which are able to pursue a great degree of research and innovation are actually able to contribute to employment generation. So how does it happen? I mean, we are able to see for various groups of industries that the elasticity of employment with respect to research and development expenditure, after controlling for the value added and the wage rate, is positive and statistically significant for a variety of industries, starting from consumer goods to different machine goods and different kinds of goods. So then the question comes up, how do we rationalize it? So from the company level balance sheets, from the company level reports, we were trying to see that firms which are able to sort of introduce more processing of byproducts and are able to pursue product diversification are the ones which are able to create a lot of employment opportunities. Instead of instead of experiencing a steady increase in capital accumulation, it is found that indivisibilities exist, and those indivisibilities are enabling them to pursue product diversification. So processing of byproducts, which they used to throw away earlier or sell them at a throwaway price to the small units or micro enterprises, now are being actually processed within the large units or medium-sized units. So as a result, what is happening, even in the main unit, there has been a decline in employment due to adoption of capital-intensive technology. The diversification has enable them to channelize the extra labor to those new units. And therefore, at the firm level, at the aggregate level, we are not able to see that there has been any decline in employment. Rather, there has been an increase in employment. So that sort of gives us some kind of confidence to say that we can face the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. Golder study had tried to look at another important aspect, that was your trade liberalization. And so he considered a considerably long time period, and he pointed out that trade liberalization did play a major role in creating employment opportunities. Though there are sort of very conflicting views, many studies have said that no, we have not really benefited from the exports of the labor-intensive goods. But he tries to point out that, yes, it has created a lot of positive impact on labor demand. So lack of product innovation reduces employment growth. If new markets are not created, the products are not able to compete with trade rivals due to poor quality. So they say that the total factor productivity growth is instrumental. Industries which are able to experience rapid total factor productivity growth are the ones where you will be able to see that rapid expansion is taking place, and such rapid expansion is also resulting in employment growth. So it is not that productivity and employment trade-offs are always binding on us. It is still possible that productivity growth can take place, competitiveness will increase, that will result in expansion, and from that expansion, new employment can be created. Now, coming to the labor market regulations, there are large number of studies starting from Beasley and Burgess and the critiques of that study, and then research has also been pursued in this context. So they have tried to point out that labor market regulations are the major constraints to employment creation, particularly when it is pro-employer. It tends to reduce the pace of employment creation. So we will have to make it to pro-employer, then only there would be a significant increase in employment. I am not going into these studies, in details of these studies, but they are very recent. Some of them have been undertaken only in 2020, and they argued that including low labor force participation rates and low levels of employment in the formal sector in the developing countries are due to restrictive labor regulations. Now, given the vast supplies of unskilled and semi-skilled variety of labor, excess supplies, limited demand situation has emerged in many activities. Labor demand has decelerated, particularly because of the mismatch between the kind of labor wanted by the employers and the kind of labor which is available in the labor market. The poor employability of the existing workforce, in fact, is a major lacking. Sherverik's work in 2018 pointed out that in India, employment growth has been gender-centric and mainly concentrated in the urban areas. But while saying that it is mainly concentrated in the urban areas, makes a very interesting point. He tries to say that it is happening only in the existing urban areas. It is not really happening. The employment growth is not taking place in the rural non-farm sector. So therefore, the rural transformation is not taking place, and the reclassification of the rural areas as urban is almost impossible. So there are many census towns, almost 2,500 census towns emerged between 2001 and 11. And now, as Debolina Kundu was mentioning the other day, perhaps there are more than 5,000 new census towns would be emerging soon. But the government of India will not be able to give them the status of these statutory towns. That is precisely because they do not have any allocation for public, for infrastructural investment, and hence they will not be able to meet all the definitional characteristics of the statutory town. So from that point of view,
If we ask questions.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just.
One second. Mariam,
sorry.
on Zoom.
If you don't mind, because because according to what I thought is census town to statutory is not linked to infrastructure, is linked to nature of employment. So
Definitely.
if you say that there is a large number of new census towns, this means there is a labor structural transformation.
See,
And you are saying, if I understood correctly, that actually the labor demand is in existing urban areas and is not
really happening in the
it seems
in the rural
contradictory
areas.
to me.
See, no, I'll explain.
Yeah.
So there are basically two ways of looking at it. In fact, you can identify two important components within the rural non-farm sector. One is the supply push effect. The other is the demand-induced component. So to what extent the demand-induced component is increasing within the rural areas so that they will be able to generate gainful employment opportunities. Because this is not happening, except in a few pockets like Maharashtra and Gujarat, in the rest of the Indian states, you are able to see labor being pushed out of the agriculture and who is not able to migrate to the urban spaces. So they are engaged in sort of petty activities.
Right, okay.
So from definitional point of view, you are able to see that, yes, there is a diversification, but that diversification does not really result in gainful livelihood opportunities, which will not provide us the definition to qualify for the statutory tax. So that is the point which Verick has tried to point out. This is the reason why that so many, if you consider the census towns as the potential urban areas, so it's only the a click that would qualify them to come to the statutory towns. And unless a proper public investment, etc., is made in these spaces, you will not be able to envisage the actual transformation process. There is hardly any investment going into it. In the rural areas, less opportunities for diversification exist. Agriculture has been in a state of stagnation. So the emergence of new urban areas is almost absent. So they are dangling between the two, neither rural nor urban. So on the whole, what we are able to see that the role of urbanization in creating livelihood opportunities and reducing poverty is rather limited. Now, we have sort of tried to now move into the empirical analysis that what kind of variables we would choose. The World Bank wanted us to consider different variants of employment indicators. We could consider the employment elasticity. Also, we could consider the rate of growth in employment, because employment elasticity is more complex. It is the ratio of the rate of growth in employment vis-a-vis the rate of growth in value added, a more complex indicator. And it is very difficult to identify important correlates with that complex indicator. So alternately, one could take rate of growth in employment. Also, one could take the quality employment, that is regular wage employment. Of course, I don't mean to say that all regular wage employment is sort of kind of a valued thing, that you have a lack of contract, you have lack of retirement benefits in many of these regular employment. But broadly speaking, among these three categories of regular wage employment, casual wage employment, and self-employment, we are considering that regular wage employment is relatively better. And then we have considered a wide range of variables which would fall into the domain of physical infrastructure, the financial infrastructure, the role of government, particularly the way the fiscal policy is implemented, and also the education and health specific indicators. And also we have considered industrialization as one of the important variables, that to what extent industrialization and the employment indicators are positively associated. For a more comprehensive analysis, we have also considered the sectoral employment growth rate and the sectoral employment growth rate in terms of formal and informal sector. Now, as far as evidence is concerned, the results for the aggregate employment elasticity and other correlates show that there are about, we have basically done a factor analysis to identify the broad correlates. So we could see that there are about 5 factors which are statistically significant. The factor loading corresponding to the aggregate employment elasticity does not turn out to be high in either of these factors, and which is understandable because it's a complex indicator. However, it bears a positive relationship with educational attainments, as the percentage of population with secondary, higher secondary, and graduate level education take high to moderate factor loadings. On the other hand, the quality of employment matters in deciding the labor force participation rate. So if we are saying that the labor force participation rate has been sluggish in certain areas, particularly for women, the labor force participation rate has been declining or has not been increasing rapidly or as per our expectation, it is precisely because we do not have the decent employment growth for women. So there is a mismatch between the expected employment and the actual type of employment which is being generated. So the percentage of regular wage employment rises, the employment elasticity tends to increase. industry, though nominally, does play a key role in improving the employment elasticity. So we do have some evidence to suggest that industry-led growth is still very much relevant for the in the Indian context. However, the extent of association is not really very strong. That is precisely because it has not happened that way. But even then, without having a rapid industrialization, without having a rapid employment growth in the industrial sector, we are able to show that there is a statistically significant positive association. So what it means that hypothetically, we could have experienced, and there is potential to sort of allocate more investment into those areas. In terms of infrastructure, rail and tele-density and post office availability, which is a broad indicator of certain dynamism, show a positive association. Similarly, among the social infrastructure indicators, the number of teachers per 1,000 population and hospital bed to population ratio contribute to the improvement in employment elasticity, though the level of association is throughout nominal. We have sort of undertaken a wide range of experiments. I'm just trying to summarize the results which emerge from these experiments.
Explain a little bit more elaborately. When you say employment elasticity, let us say for regular employment. So is this, you're looking at panel across different industrial groups over time? And
no, this is a panel over time, and also we are doing it at the aggregate level. We are also doing at the sectoral level. Sectoral level, let's say overall industry, manufacturing, overall services, and also we are looking at the total employment and total including agriculture, also excluding agriculture. And employment elasticity will not consider only the regular wage employment. It would consider even the self-employment. Also, it would consider your casual wage.
And this is elasticity with respect to what?
To value added, the growth elasticity.
Okay, the growth elasticity.
Growth elasticity.
So
no, growth elasticity for organized manufacturing, it is ASI. But if you want the aggregate economy, then you have the national account statistics, which is a time series thing at the sectoral level. So you can compute the employment elasticities for different sectors. That is all. So what we have done is we start with the employment elasticity figures, and then we sort of get into the employment growth alone, because the employment elasticity is not able to find its correlates in a significant manner. And also we have tried to take only one component of the total employment, that is your regular wage employment. Sort of not considering the casual wage employment and self-employment to be something desirable. So different indicators are taken, and we are trying to see that if all these indicators of employment are at all responsive to any of these infrastructure specific and other developmental indicators.
When you say that regular employment, the share of regular employment is associated with higher elasticity, are you saying that sectors which have higher share of regular employees show a higher growth elasticity?
Employment elasticity, but extremely nominal. Association is extremely nominal. So we are able to see one cluster of observations, which the most significant cluster, which shows the positive effects of the spread of industrialization, higher levels of educational attainments, tele-density, teacher ratio, health infrastructure, urbanization, social infrastructure, urbanization, and investment on industrial employment elasticity. Another cluster where we get to see the adverse impact of many of these variables. That means either the investment scale is extremely nominal, so therefore it is not resulting any positive growth, and hence you are able to see a negative relationship at a low equilibrium level. So there is, however, a third cluster where you will able to see that some of the indicators are positive and some of the indicators are negative. So on the whole, this is the reason why you are not able to decipher a very strong relationship. So you can identify across space, you will be, and across over time, you will be able to identify certain clusters where the infrastructure and role of government has been able to promote employment, but there are regions where it has not been up to the threshold limit, and therefore we have not been able to experience rapid employment growth.
And when you say cluster, these are spatial clusters.
Special clusters. So see, for the employment, as you know, there is time series data. So basically the CLEM data set, that was a project, RBI and project on key indicators of the CLEM project was basically capital, labor, employment, energy, to generate the time series information in the Indian context, starting from almost 70s till date. And this project was financed by RBI, and it was done by Dev Kushum Das, Professor Goldar, and K. Krishna, and other associates. So basically to generate time series information on variables on which you do not have that information. And it should be comparable and acceptable at the international level, so that you have claims data set across countries, and you will be able to estimate total factor productivity growth for different sectors, and you will be able to compare India's position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So from that data set, we have taken the employment figures so that we are able to generate a panel. Otherwise, what happens? Value-added figures, you have time-wise, a time series. But employment figures, you do not have any time series. But this is how we have been able to collate the information, and we have done this analysis. So again, for service sector, which has been contributing to the value-added growth in a very significant way, the employment elasticity is not very high, and the factor loading for the employment elasticity in the service sector is again very low. If we choose one of this factor 3, which shows a slightly higher figure of factor loading for the service sector employment elasticity, most of the development indicators show a positive association. So we have basically trying to draw certain information desperately that if there is any positive association at all. And our conclusion is that, yes, there are certain sectors, there are certain key variables which can contribute to employment growth. So there is nothing to be sort of depressed about the findings. The scale of visibility is very poor, but nevertheless, they are statistically significant. So I don't go into the details of these findings. So as I mentioned, whether we take employment elasticity or we take the rate of growth of employment in different sectors, or we take only the rate of growth in regular wage employment, there is enough indication of a positive impact. And also the labor market deregulation index. This we take from the World Bank data set. I guess they have constructed this index by considering a number of variables across states. So the number of strikes, lockouts, and any unrest that has occurred in the recent past, and then they have tried to combine those figures through sort of principal component analysis, and they have arrived at a figure for each of the states. And they have also generated some kind of panel, not for each and every year, but for some certain years they have been able to replicate those exercises, and they have come up with this index. And we are able to show that the labor market deregulations play a crucial role in creating employment. If there is states which have been able to change the labor market regulations in favor of the employer, in such spaces, employment growth has taken place.
Exactly.
I won't be able to recall exactly which state in which year has recorded that. Quality of also it shows positive association. Yes, I remember now. Some of these states, like the newly industrializing states, your Orissa, Himachal Pradesh, Goa, some of the where the industrial growth rate has been almost in 2-digit level, and the employment growth rate has also been close to 7%, 8%, etc. Of course, we started from a very, very low base, so we cannot rejoice about the fact. Nevertheless, we are able to see that in some of the newly industrializing states, the labor regulations have been quite in favor of the employer. And
It could be a multi-dimensional factor, right? I mean,
That's
it's not
right.
just the labor regulation that.
no, the labor regulation itself is a multidimensional variable. So it's you cannot measure it only in terms of one indicator. You have several variables and you try to combine them, and then for each state you have a figure. And you try to replicate that exercise for a few more years, so you are able to create a panel. And then
And this kind of employment growth is still the regular employment growth or all?
See, as I mentioned, three things I have considered: the total employment, the regular wage employment, and also the employment elasticity. In all three cases, we are able to
You're
see.
seeing that.
Yeah. Of course, as I mentioned repeatedly, that the strength of association is not very, very sort of remarkable, but nevertheless, there is a positive association. Also, the volume of exports is positively associated. Of course, at the state level, this information has a lot of limitation because the export figures for each state, you cannot consider that it is originating from that state itself. Suppose West Bengal has a port. So West Bengal's exports would be enormously large because West Bengal is collecting all the materials from the neighboring states. So there is a serious limitation about this data. Nevertheless, you are able to see that there is a positive effect of exports on employment creation. And as I mentioned, if the labor market is pro-worker, regular wage employment tends to decline. On the other hand, it rises if the pro-employer situation prevails. So particularly,
The labor market is for worker, the wage.
regular wage employment tends to decline. See, if it is pro-worker, nobody wants to employ them directly. They would all be
Casualization
recruited,
will
yes,
increase, basically.
or contractualization. Contractualization. So the findings confirm the importance of physical communication and social infrastructure in augmenting the employment elasticity, employment growth, and also quality employment. Higher levels of educational attainments improve the employability of the available workforce, thus contributing to labor demand. The availability of quality employment also encourages the population to acquire skill and education. So you cannot say that it is only the employability which is poor employability which is responsible for sluggish employment growth. It is also from the other side, we will also have to see that the demand for labor is not increasing very rapidly. So the overall investment climate and an effective state as envisaged in terms of increased social expenditure in relative terms are instrumental to improvements in employment growth and employment elasticity. The findings reinforce the role of industry-led growth and agglomeration economies in contributing to employment growth. Though we have said that the services growth has been much faster than the industrial growth. In fact, we were doing some technical exercise, Professor Golder and myself, and we had tried to look at the volatility that the two different sectors have experienced, the industrial growth rate and the services growth rate. The industrial growth rate has experienced obviously a stronger volatility. We know about that. In spite of that, in the long run, we are able to see that the industrialization actually accounts for contributes to the overall growth to a much larger extent vis-a-vis the services sector. In terms of magnitude, services sector might outweigh the contribution of the industrial sector. But then if you are considering the other technical indicators, that is the impulse response or the variance decomposition, then you are able to see that the industry actually contributes to a larger extent than the services sector. If there is a shock in the industrial sector, it is going to create a lot of negative impact on the overall economy to a larger extent, vis-a-vis the effect of services sector on the rest of the economy.
And
So
industry is just manufacturing and also construction.
it is largely, we have considered the organized manufacturing,
Or
not the unorganized component. So the routes to poor growth or growth with employment generation can be strengthened by subscribing to policies that promote the provisioning of physical, health, and educational infrastructure and encourage the population to acquire skill and make themselves employable. Though the relative size of the service sector outweighs that of the industry, it is pertinent that the strategy of industrialization is recognized as instrumental to creating productive employment opportunities. This is the reason why I was sort of trying to highlight this point. And also we believe that interspecial spillover effects, which is not happening now, can take place to a greater extent and higher levels of urbanization can be attained. So the growth of non-farm employment and urbanization both can then coexist. Now I move on to another set of PPTs where we talk about the barriers to employment at the individual level. We have considered the unit level data from the periodic labor force survey, 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, from each of these rounds. And we try to see whether the similar findings are emerging over the years or there is any pattern of change. And what are the major constraints at the individual level? Of course, as you know, these unit level data do not have a large number of variables, very limited information, some background characteristics, familial characteristics about caste, etc., and a little bit on the occupation and the educational characteristics. So based on that, we have to call out that to what extent the lack of education or skill is a major constraint and whether we can actually will be able to overcome that. Supply side constraints may operate to adversely affect the labor market flexibility of the participants. Education and skills related problems are the most common ones, as the available skills may not match the demand requirements. What is more damaging and deleterious is discrimination against a particular group, particularly when we see that certain caste groups are not with same level of education, are not able to experience any entry to the labor market of particular jobs, or they are not able to experience any upward mobility within the labor market. The familial background and certain associated disadvantages are expected to get dissipated as one sort of acquires higher levels of human capital, so that the familial negative characteristics will be neutralized by the educational attainment level. This is what we expect, but whether that is really happening or not. Also, there is an important view that the migration status and the labor market outcomes, that can be very, very different. People who are have migrated from the rural areas, for example, even if they are well informed through the informal channels about the labor market, still labor market segmentation is very important for them, which means that there is information asymmetry for the migrants compared to their native counterparts. So from that point of view, the migrants may be at a disadvantageous position. And that becomes evident when you consider the duration of migration. Those who have been able to stay for a long time, perhaps they are approaching to almost the status of the natives. But those who are the fresh migrants, they are the ones who do not have, for them, the information asymmetry is very, very much prevalent. So experiences on upward mobility tend to vary across castes and communities. That also is an important observation. Differences in educational attainment levels or skills also generate different impact on mobility. In fact, individuals with different levels of education pursue different job search strategies. Not necessarily all of them will be having similar kinds of strategies. Even within the domain of informal strategies, it tends to vary across caste groups across different educational attainments. Of course, the literature also has talked about many such variables. The neighborhood characteristics, for example, is very, very important. So we, of course, could not consider those variables in our model. Only the rural-urban, that dimension we have been able to introduce. Certain movements between the informal sector jobs and the informal jobs in the formal sector are perceivable, because contextualization, etc., is being practiced within the formal sector on a very large scale. So basically to take advantage of the informality. And you are able to see that some people have moved from the informal sector to the informal job in the formal sector. But does that mean a major change in their livelihood in terms of wages, etc.? So these are some of the important questions that we need to look into, because that is a cost-cutting strategy for the firms to introduce your informal employment. Now, keeping that in mind, we have looked into the periodic labor force survey data, and based on the unit level data, we have generated certain state-specific figures, etc. So one important point that is about the
when you say the variations in size of the formal sector, it is based on the PLFS data, the share of the formal employment.
That's right. In the PLFS data, they have given you, they have adopted basically the National Commission on Unorganized Enterprise, that definition, basically that size criterion. And based on that, they have sort of demarcated that what is the relative informal and formal sector share.
That is okay. And that is varying a lot.
Varying a lot across states. And also, what is important that at the aggregate level, the relative size of the informal sector has declined. Earlier, if you recall, it used to be some 90 plus, isn't it? And now at the all India level, you have only 85% of all the workers are engaged in the informal sector. This is inclusive of agriculture.
This variation is odd given the fact that it's supposed to be a panel, right? So
yeah, 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20, 20, 21. Yeah.
It's an overlapping panel,
yeah.
so it is very odd to see the variation. But anyway, it is the data is what it is.
Not really overlapping, because it ends in.
No, but within the year, there is a panel structure.
Yeah. So neither the size at the all India level nor the interstate variations in the size of the informal sector seems to be changing over time. Of course, this is a very short time span, only about 4 years or 5 years, and that too, COVID came in. So, but nevertheless, we are not able to see the major change in the variations over time. Within the states, however, the shares have changed somewhat, and the directions of change are not similar, though, after a dip in 2018-19 compared to 17-18. So across state variations are by and large same, but within a given state, you will be able to see that there are some changes taking place over time. So there is an increase in 2019-20 and 2021, as witnessed by many states, could be because of the COVID fact. So within the formal sector, an overwhelmingly large population is engaged as regular wage workers. This is understandable, that because self-employment within the formal sector is very, very nominal. Nearly 15% of the formal sector workers are employed as casual workers. Similarly, within the informal sector, the self-employed comprise a little more than 60%, and around 1/4 can be identified as casual workers. But the share of regular wage workers within the informal sector is not negligible. Earlier, we had thought that regular wage employment doesn't exist within the informal sector, but now we are able to see that no, it is not negligible. That is precisely because of one important fact, that subcontracting is coming from the formal sector to the informal sector, and there is a quality control, which can be maintained only when the informal sector enterprises are able to reduce the turnover cost, labor turnover cost. So from that point of view, there has been some kind of regularization within the informal sector.
At a low salary.
At a lower salary. Of course, of course.
Yeah.
Because it is all happening through intermediaries. The formal sector pays through the intermediaries. So, of course, during the lockdown, we could see that the wage jobs in the informal sector fell majorly, and some of the sufferers took recourse to self-employment in order to earn a livelihood. We are able to see a shift from the regular wage employment to the self-employment, or from casual wage employment to self-employment. Further, the regional variations in the size of self-employment and casual employment within the informal sector are large. On the other hand, within the informal sector, the regular wage employment along with casual wage employment shows wide variations. Though a sizable percentage of the workers within the informal sector pursue self-employment, the switching possibilities between self-employment and casual employment cannot be ruled out. In fact, we had done a panel data study only for the only for the urban sector. And within the urban sector, as you know, that they take 25% of the sample in this quarter, and in the second quarter they will add another 25% and revisit those 20. In the third quarter, new 25% will be added, but those other 50% will again be revisited. So in this manner, you are able to have the same set of households for the urban areas in different quarters. So we were trying to look at this phenomenon, to what extent the households or the individuals are engaged in similar activity in all the quarters in the urban areas. In the rural areas, the changing employment phenomenon is very much prevalent. We know that people in the off season will come to the non-agriculture, go back to the agriculture during the harvest season, etc. But here in the urban sector, we were quite surprised to see that there is significant variations in the employment, not only just the nature of employment, but also the type of employment that they pursue in one quarter and shift to another type of employment in the next quarter. So such kind of variations are very much evident. The next point of interest relates to the differences in the wage rates. The wage rate of the casual workers is given for each of the, so we have tried to make some approximations and calculate the earnings for the self-employed workers, for the casual wage workers, and also for the regular wage workers. Within the informal sector, the regular wages, both in the rural and urban areas, are much lower than their formal sector counterparts, which you were just mentioning. The female wages, both in the rural and urban areas, are lower than the male wages. The urban wages are higher than the rural wages. The urban informal sector offers better remuneration compared to the rural informal sector. So similar patterns are observed among the earnings of the self-employed workers. Again, among the casual workers, the formal-informal wage differences are marginal. So whether one is working in the informal sector as a casual worker or a contractual employee in the formal sector, the earnings are by and large the same. So over time, the wages, even in nominal terms, are not necessarily following an increasing trend in all these categories. That is the, I think, the rock bottom of the wages are not at all rising over this 4-year period. Of course, the justification is that if there was a COVID situation, etc. Otherwise, also there is anyway. So now we come to a little more substantive analysis that we try to do the occupational choice function. Another just 5 minutes or so. So occupational choice function, and then to explain the wage differences. So occupational choice function, basically we are following a multinomial logic model that to what extent the caste background, the familial characteristics, the educational levels, and the caste categories matter in picking up a particular occupation. And then in the second stage, when we were doing the wage function, we could have done a simple, Mensurian function. But there is an endogeneity problem. So let me just briefly tell you about the findings for the occupational choice function. We have considered 6 categories. Within the formal sector, you have 3 categories. Within the informal sector, you have 6 categories. categories. So one of them is taken as a comparison category, and then we have the occupational choice function for all other categories. We are able to see that the probability of joining informal self-employment is less for the scheduled caste workers vis-a-vis the scheduled tribes. All that we are trying to say that certain activities, certain type of activities are more prone to the joining of certain caste categories, and similarly in terms of education, you have certain activities where the less educated people with less human capital formation are more likely to join. In fact, if you the lower, I mean, the disadvantaged caste categories are less likely to be in regular wage jobs, particularly in the formal sector. Then let me just skip these parts. So, okay. Now we come to the wage function. As I mentioned, we could have gone simply to estimate a OLS equation in terms of wages, in terms of certain human capital formation and familial and caste categories, but then that would have an endogeneity problem. The endogeneity problem arises because of the fact that occupation will have to enter on the right side of the wage function. And because occupation is actually being determined, so you cannot treat it as a exogenous variable. So the empirical strategy is as follows. We take the OLS as the base run, and we pretend as if the occupational categories are exogenously given. Then we try to rectify our stand by considering, first estimate the occupational choice function. You estimate the probabilities, then you take those probabilities and put them in the wage function, so that they help you overcome the endogeneity problem. Alternately, based on the estimated probabilities, you work out the estimated categories of employment. And based on the estimated categories of employment, you generate the dummies, occupational dummies, and you put them on the right-hand side, which can be treated as the 2 SLS estimates. On the whole, I mean, whether you take the OLS estimate or you take all these econometric refinements, we are able to see that the wages or earnings for the informal self-employed, informal regular, and formal casual workers turn out to be lower, while the formal self-employment and the formal regular workers are seen to be earning more.
You're saying
taking the informal casual as the base category.
And informal regular earns less than the informal.
The wage earnings for the informal self-employed, informal regular, and formal casual workers turn out to be lower.
And this is not just the daily wage. This is their wage earning for like a month kind of structure.
I mean, from the month we have sort of deduced it, converted it into the daily basis.
Just to rephrase, means in the formal sector, whichever your status.
No, in the informal
Informal casual.
Informal casual, compared to the informal casual, the wage earnings for the informal self-employed, informal regular wage workers, and formal casual workers turn out to be lower.
It's actually quite counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's counterintuitive, not everything.
That informal regular. Yeah.
So if you're formal casual, you have less than.
Informal casual.
That's right. Similarly, the informal regular wage workers are also earning less compared to the.
I mean, fundamentally, what I'm hearing is this is because you're controlling for the endogeneity.
That's right. For a large number of
they have control for the industry. So within an industry, this is the pattern. It just so happens that we tend to see formal casual earning more because they are in higher wage industries.
Yes.
I mean, that is the sort of.
Yeah.
Right, so within an industry.
So
Which means that the informal casual is the guy who feeds in and he has more negotiating and bargaining power in this industry.
or
Can you put on the mic?
could be.
The button
Could
at the
be,
top.
or
No, the
sometimes
button.
what happens, the informal casual wage is revised from time to time.
Or it's because I really need these 5 guys to make my product line, so I'm willing to pay them more.
Or maybe it's NREG.
Huh?
Maybe it's NREG.
Yeah, NREG also has an impact.
Hmm.
Because if you put them in
It's a
a
wage flow,
wage flow, in a sort of general
In the
equilibrium
informal sector.
context,
informal casual.
informal casual wage.
So which means that it's contradictory with the idea that your labor regulation, because NREG in a sense is a strict and rigid labor regulation, saying that there's a
Is there-
minimum floor salary, right?
It is a wage flow.
Right?
So it should be interesting, the discussion to understand what type of labor regulation may be an issue. But the wage floor by itself may lead to something like this. Now, what the employment effect of these are is different. Huh?
Right.
It's only the
Yeah,
wage.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
only
Yeah, yeah.
the wages, yeah,
So less people may be earning more, but. yeah.
Yes.
right. Of course, the
It's
formal
complex, yeah, yeah.
self-employed and the formal regular workers are better off, which is understandable.
Yeah.
But the point is that if you just look at the descriptive statistics, if you just look at the wages for different categories within formal and informal, this sort of finding doesn't come up.
Right.
When you do a sort of wage function estimation and sort of control for other important variables, then this finding we are able to decipher. So in the conclusion, we will say that the labor market is highly heterogeneous and there are 6 types of employment configurations you are able to see, and not necessarily there are enough linkages among these sectors, though the informal sector, casual employment and the casual employment in the formal sector can be having strong associations. The rural urban special variations in occupational choices and the wage rates are significant. Those who are able to migrate to the urban spaces would naturally be better off compared to the rural residents. The barriers to migration therefore impinge on the labor market outcomes and the wages the workers earn. The caste factor also has an association with the occupational categories and the remunerations associated with them. Finally, the educational attainments are seen to be strongly impacting on the occupational choices and the wage outcomes. To put it very bluntly, the quality of education and our educational attainment levels are perhaps not able to mitigate the resilience of the caste factor. That is what I would say. So that is where I would stop. Sorry.
Thank you so much. We'll open the floor out for questions and comments from the room as well as in Zoom. If you're on Zoom and still listening in, you can raise your hands and we'll bring you into the conversation. So I do see a few people still hanging in there. So please just raise your hands and even if you want to clarify or ask questions or add your own perspectives to the discussion. Anyone in the room wants to go first? Yeah, sure. Partha,
It was really interesting to listen to you because
Can you also introduce yourself?
my name is Neelkant. I studied in the University of Delhi. I completed my MPhil, and now I'm trying to engage myself in what we call research. So that's why I'm here. So, I really I enjoyed thoroughly, because what I wanted to ask, perhaps you, in your subsequent words, you have answered most of them. The question that comes to my mind, because you talked about rural availability of these factors like educational attainments or the choices that are available for people. Do you think there is any sort of change in terms of how people are trying to, for example, you said there are different sort of strategies that people make, even in informal sectors, to find jobs, to link up to some people in the urban sector. Do you think there is a sort of change in terms of the skills required? Because you also mentioned the market labor, which is looking for certain skills. Perhaps that is not being attained or given to them through the educational system. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. See, this particular point I cannot answer through the analysis that I have gone through, but we have done some primary surveys. And there we could see that there is a mismatch often between the skill that the rural migrants wear and the skills that are required in the urban spaces. Nevertheless, many of them actually are able to cope with the requirements in the urban space. In fact, you can do a survey in the mobile repair sector. How, without having higher levels of education, the amount of technical knowledge that they have, I mean, we will fail in front of them, the way they are able to cater to the requirements. So it is happening. I would not say that such changes are not at all present, but it is at a limited scale and in a few sectors. When you talk about the seasonal labor, when you talk about the short duration migrants or medium duration migrants, I think there is a lot more needs to be done. The quality of education or the communication skills that they have acquired do not often match with the urban requirements. So there is a lot to do in that front.
Yeah. I am Shyam Babu from CPR. Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. You mentioned how education impacts job choices and wages. My question is not even a question, just a loud thinking is, most of the education we are providing, the degrees we are churning out are in social sciences, like MBS from regional universities going and working as career boys. So when there is no link between a particular skill and the job sought, my guess is that is most of the time. So what is the value of education? Can we really make a difference?
Absolutely, I agree with you that the quality of education. In fact, when I was answering his question, that even those who have acquired some education in the rural sphere and they try to migrate to the urban spaces, they are not able to sort of match up the requirements. That is the reason why education is not able to mitigate the caste disadvantages, the familial disadvantages. Though theory had always allowed us to think that education will be able to help us to overcome these constraints. So that's very important, the quality. In fact, when it comes to the quality of the ITIs, there have been some studies, CDS has conducted some studies on this, but very poor quality. First of all, the number of ITIs has been pretty low, though the Ministry of Skill Development, etc., was created. And now you have many more ITIs, but still, this is industrial training institutes. So here the industry is used in a very broad sense. I mean, there could be plumbers, there could be skilled construction workers, electricians, all kinds of activities are conducted here. So the quality of ITIs is extremely poor. And in fact, the CDS study pointed out that many Middle East companies, they come to India to recruit the ITI graduates. However, before they are sent to the Middle East countries, they are retrained to meet their requirements. So first of all, they are choosing the creamy layer, and that creamy layer is being retrained before they are sent to the work
I actually wanted to add something to that. It's not just happening with ITIs. This retraining seems to be happening. So there is now this huge emerging industry of global, preparing Indian workers for global migration in non-knowledge sectors. So because I work on migration, some of my friends have jumped from research into this sort of more training and capacity building kind of endeavor, and they're working in all kinds of strange places, training not only men and women for this, but even within a city. Like I did some fieldwork in Mangalore. Now Mangalore has an old industrial sort of a setup, and then a new, more knowledge-based setup, and a lot of private training institutes, a lot of training institutes that have been set up by the local industry or by local elites. But even those training institutes are not able to supply labor that can have the proper skill match with what the employer wants. So I found it really interesting that if the Chamber of Commerce is sort of running or financing or affiliated with a set of training establishments, the members of the same chambers of commerce who were employers were complaining about not being able to find labor with the right skills, even though they had direct control over the training establishments. So this tells me that there isn't actually enough understanding of what kind of skills exactly. I mean, it's
Is
not just about technical skill, it's
No,
some
it's
combination of
about, yeah.
technical, soft, match. I mean, there's a lot of more nuance to it than just, you know, a particular skill, which may also explain why, casual, formal workers
Yeah.
stay in those industries for long period of time because they've learned on the job, and even though they are not formalized, they are still valuable, and they know that they will get employed when they go to a particular industry. So I mean, is this where we are with this whole skill? I mean, what is your estimation of what the issue is?
See, first of all, the kind of skill which is imparted in our institutes, that doesn't give you the scope for occupational flexibility. That is a major constraint. Unless you have the occupational flexibility, you get stuck in one place. Secondly, you do not have the scope for on-the-job training, particularly if you are a contractual. Nobody wants to spend any money on the contractual employees. And the share of regular wage employment in most of the industries has come down significantly. Even in the services sector, you can actually identify two segments, high productivity segment and a very low productivity segment. In the low productivity segment, there is absolutely no scope. Even in the high productivity segment, when you are hiring the casual workers, you do not provide them any kind of training, which will add to their skill formation, because that is an additional cost to the employer. These are the two important reasons that compared to China and South Korea, or the kind of skill imparting schemes they have, India's situation is nothing.
Maybe I have to add on to that, because you talked about occupational inflexibility and the educational
Yeah,
system.
yeah.
Do you think the recent educational policy by the present government, which is been brought up largely in order to make it more market friendly?
I know.
Or according to the needs.
Absolutely.
Do
We have been scratching our head, breaking our head to sort of follow the image of the new educational policy, and accordingly we are trying to develop a integrated BSMS program, not to talk about the technical institutes. And yes, you get to see that there is scope for skill imparting courses in the undergraduate level. So when a BA pass out comes and joins the labor market, should have greater flexibility. I really don't, except the language courses, I really don't see. Yes, one thing you can say, that the computer literacy, that every organization is trying to see to the fact that they acquire that skill. Otherwise,
There are also something mobile repair and computer. Mobile repair and computer repair, what happens is they have all these meters to see which part is not functioning. They simply replace the part. There's not really some skill there.
No.
Maybe within a week I can acquire that skill.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all picked up
Yes.
on the job and on trial and error basis.
Okay, so I know Shumindro has a question. Anybody else, so that we can maybe line up a couple? Or we'll go one by one?
And is there something online?
No, not yet.
I was basically trying to say that they have the potentiality. You
Yes.
can't say that they are absolutely stupid.
This is very exhaustive. I was trying to relate with two parts of my story and the individual. One thing that you told a lot about the micro story about both in this central theme of dualism, not maybe dualism, maybe multidimensionality in the Indian labor market. In the macro perspective, you link it to urbanization, that we have a duality in our urbanization economic growth criteria, where we have a very highly high growth sector in larger cities and a more of labor intensive sector in the census town and medium sized. So coming back, relating back to what you say to your individual story, that the labor market is segmented in the cities as well and the villages. How can we link these two dynamics that the economic potential in the smaller towns, are there any way related to all the structural barriers that you have just told in terms of educational attainment? Because we have seen that we have progressed a lot in terms of educational attainment for the past
That's right.
30 years.
That's
We've picked up. Maybe the quality of employment and specialization of skills, as you mentioned, are not at par, but it's really picking up. So what's your comment on that? Second comment is question is also more on when you look at the trajectory of the census towns, you have seen that they come in really divergent state economies, right? You have West Bengal, Odisha,
Right.
Odisha is not, some in Jharkhand, that cluster is a big, and Eastern UP, for example. And you have industrialized states like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu also coming up. So my second question is how to explain that dualism again? Like you have a parallel dynamic, some farm to non-farm transitions in really divergent state economies in terms of their growth numbers, in terms of their economic trajectories, and labor market potential and migration metrics as well. So do you explain it in terms of your demand pull versus distress push framework, or do you want to situate it in a gap of the kind of employment they are offering and it's not sufficient to this thing? Because some of the prediction stuff that we have done before, it shows that the future urbanization across this path, and that's why this question comes very important to me. The third question I had was, you talk about the spatial clustering in your first part of your presentation, right? Now, do you have any insight on you segregate these structural barriers across the more clustered part, and so not like economically specialized regions, because any form of sustainable growth in this form needs economic specialization, and your presentation says that that's happening in some parts. So the supply side factors, do you see any kinds of visible differences across these three sets of things?
See, when I was pursuing the macro part, my emphasis was largely on the demand side factors. That in what way the labor demand can be increased, particularly when it comes to the quality employment, which is envisaged in terms of regular wage employment, or even the aggregate employment in a very, very broad way, principal, usual status, subsidiary status, everything. In what way I mean, one is posing this question whether policy will at all have any impact or not. And we do have some evidence to suggest that it is possible to sort of augment the scale of activities, and that may contribute to employment. Then from the micro study, unit level study, we were trying to bring in this fact that when as demand expands, whether our people will actually be able to get benefited or not. So from that point of view, you are bringing in the familial characteristics and the educational attainments, etc. And from that perspective, again, we are able to see that the wage growth is extremely nominal. Even in nominal terms, wage growth has not taken place. You leave out the creamy layer, those who are in very high productivity jobs. Otherwise, on an average, the wage rate has not increased. So from that point of view, one is talking about the quality of education, etc. So even if hypothetically, even if the policy is successful and it is able to expand the scale of economic activities and is able to generate labor demand, our quality may not still match with those requirements. So from that point of view, one is basically trying to say that we need to work more on the quality of education so that it would be able to mitigate the familial disadvantages, and it would be able to improve the employability of the workforce in the labor market. So I'm not taking the demand side view or the supply side view. That is why I decided to bring in these two perspectives. The third perspective, that is the enterprise level perspective. What are the constraints that operate at the enterprise level? I did not bring in that. As far as spatial variations is concerned, it is very important. I was very keen to do that kind of an analysis, but unfortunately, we are doing the analysis at the state level. See, because many variables are not available at a disaggregated spatial unit. And when you are doing this analysis for the state level, you have time series cross section. Okay. variations. So from that point of view, you have a large number of observations to do, but then it's very difficult to justify empirical assessment analysis. In what way Maharashtra 2017 is different from Maharashtra 2014? That is the reason why we have not done that interspatial analysis. We just put them together at the state level. If we would have had data at the district level, I would have then pursued the different cluster analysis and identify the pockets where such problems exist. This is only indicative of the fact that the states are not in a stagnant position. Maharashtra 2017 is remarkably different from Maharashtra 2010. But then to identify each and every indicator and to show that, look, in this respect, this state has moved far away, that would be too much to do it for every state for every year. That is why I have suppressed it. I'm only saying that you can broadly identify 3 clusters where the positive effect of policy is extremely noticeable. Another group where it is operating at a very lower level, therefore you are not able to see any positive effect, rather there is a negative effect. The certain variables have picked up, but the outcome variables have not been able to catch up. And the third cluster where you have a very mixed picture, where some variables are showing positive, some variables are showing negative.
I have one clarification question. I did not see that slide very well.
I'm sorry, I did not realize that my font was so small.
When you calculated the average wage for casual daily laborers by month, how did you do that? So you took.
So you have the information for casual wage workers.
Yeah.
You have the information for at weekly rate. So from the weekly rate, you sort of try to work out the monthly.
Okay. So multiplied by 4.
Yeah, do some adjustments, etc. Similarly, for the self-employed workers, you have the earnings, and then
Self-employment is clear, yeah.
for the regular wage workers, it's easy. So.
Anyone else has something to say? Partho?
Yeah, I was just, like somebody else. Nobody else did. No, I mean, Arup, I'm trying to sort of make sense of a lot of stuff, so help me with this. One, the big story is infrastructure matters, social infrastructure matters, and regulations matter. But if I take a look at what has happened to India in the last 25 years, you've had exceptional investment in infrastructure, step change. Definitely a much larger number of people who are leaving school or at least have 8 years of education. The distribution has shifted substantially. The quality is an issue that we can definitely talk about. And I don't think anyone would argue that labor regulations, even if they have got stronger on paper, which they have not, in terms, since the unions have become almost non-existent, that the effectiveness of labor regulations, if at all, has been less, has gone down.
Yeah,
right?
Very much.
So, if this broad story is true, all the 3 conditions that you laid out have become better in the last few years, over the last 20 years. But your employment story is not responding, right? So, in a sense, how do I make sense of that?
Shall I answer? Yeah. So what we are trying to say that you cannot completely disregard the impact of policy in terms of these variables on employment. There are certain clusters, there are certain variables which are significant, but very, very nominal. So we will have to look into the point that why the effect has been nominal. That is one question. But that doesn't mean that the policy has not worked at all or doesn't have any potential, because these variables have increased over in last 20 years, but had made very nominal effect on employment. That is the reason the factor loadings are extremely nominal in magnitude. But it doesn't say that it is negative or it is completely statistically insignificant. That is the only message that one is trying to give. That yes, it does have a future. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any future. As far as labor regulations are concerned, I am absolutely in agreement with you that labor regulations are not really binding on us. Even if they have not deregulated in pen and paper, there are many practical mechanisms through which the labor market deregulations have entered through the back doors. You just change the composition, regular versus contractual. Automatically, your wage burden comes down. There are certain number of companies. There are, when it comes to FDI, when it comes to some of the large enterprises, the labor regulations do matter. So there, they would be more conscious about what actually is being entered in pen and paper. And they are scared of these violations, particularly when they are hiring the regular workers. So from that point of view, we are saying that labor regulations, in whatever manner it exists, even if the unions have become docile, it does matter when it comes to recruitment of regular wage employment. So if we work on that, for example, earlier you did not have this provision of hiring someone for more than 2 years on contractual basis. If you do that, you will have to regularize that person. Now, there has been some amendment on the appointment of casual work or contractual workers. So what they do, they give a gap, small gap of few days, and reappoint them. So, but that provision is now given to the employer, which did not exist earlier. In that sense, you can say that contractualization has increased. So contractual employment in the formal sector has increased. And part of this contractual employment is actually shown up as regular wage employment. Because there is no way how you would be able to distinguish between a long-term contractual employee and the regular wage. So all that I'm trying to say, that regular wage employment is not really an indicator of quality of employment, always. Though we have tried to do that in the analysis. So there are problems. But nevertheless, it has been seen that when it comes to FDI, the labor regulations are extremely important. And that has encouraged many, many firms to pursue capital-intensive and skill-intensive technology.
FDI would represent how much of employment?
See, whatever it could.
Because the argument would be that because of these problems, the FDI is low.
And FDI is not labor intensive.
It's very contentious.
And also the domestic investment is not labor intensive. The expansion is not really creating more employment opportunities.
So I think we have the same debate.
Is your thing on?
Not only in developing countries about attracting FDI and transforming labor regulations, and I mean how much when it's totally out of academic questions. As part of will take them after I make my comment, but how much of it is lobbying by large scale manufacturing and FDI to argue that labor regulation is really a hindrance on them?
Hindrance on employment. See, I had done a separate study, not a part of this study, for 63 groups of 3-digit level industries for the manufacturing sector. And I was trying to figure out the wage sensitivity of employment. in most out of 63 groups of industries, for most, I mean, most means almost 58, 59 groups of industries, and also at the aggregate level, it is either not statistically significant, or even when it is significant, the wage sensitivity is extremely low, 0.0 something. So hypothetically, if you reduce the wage further through deregulation, it is not going to really create employment on a large scale. The technology is such that you don't need the human faces anymore. Now the question is whether if you do not have the labor deregulations, that may promote the skill intensive, the capital intensive technology to a larger extent. That's the point.
Right.
So, we have no one else on the, no Zoom questions, right?
No.
So, Farooq, the second set of questions that we're trying to make sense of is, so you mentioned the story about large firms diversifying and moving employment into,
Right.
sort of
the large firms, the informal sector.
mid-sized firm structure, right? And you also mentioned that it could also be, what it does is, previously this work they have in some sense insourced work that would have been done elsewhere, right? That the raw material would go out and would get processed by informal firms. Now that raw material is being processed in-house.
Or they used to, Annapurna Shaw's paper way back in
Yeah,
11.
yeah.
Basically, she talked about that how they dispose of those
Exactly, yeah.
products.
So now that they're not disposing and using,
they are sort of pursuing certain extract.
at the aggregate level, wouldn't you expect a decline in employment? Because those people who are using it will be much more labor intensive, and these people are using it. So this is one issue, right? The second thing is this whole issue of, as you mentioned, contractual and skill. You are having now a workforce which is better skilled, may not be skilled enough, and that is the argument that Mukta was bringing about. And instead of, in some sense, trying to invest in the skill of that workforce, like the IT sector is doing. So let's say when Infosys does Campus Connect, it actually works with training providers to give additional skills so that they can have a better pool to choose from. So instead of doing that, industry is contractualizing. I hire somebody, this person turns out to be randomly a better skilled person, I keep that person. That turns out not to be, I let that person go, right? So I'm continuously selecting and trying to help my structure on through, right? So do you have any sense from your surveys or structures, etc., as to what is it that, because if you look at East Asia, Southeast Asia, those structures, a lot of them have been driven by investment in the skill of the workforce. I mean, they come with a better skilled workforce, better quality workforce, and the body invests in them. So is there some threshold effect that we are lacking, that the industry does not feel confident enough to invest in the workers because the worker is not skilled enough? That if they had crossed some threshold that they would have, what is the explanation in that sense? And finally, this whole story about the flexibility thing that you brought about at the end. And yet, when you were speaking, you said that in your work with the PLFS, you found that even in the urban areas, there was a lot of people moving around different structures, right? So, what is the flexibility story there? Is that something?
So see the flexibility here. What is happening? It is a employment poverty-induced activity, and there is a demand-induced activity. So when one is using the term flexibility in a positive sense, that I am able to shift from one gainful lively opportunity to another gainful lively opportunity. Here what is happening? Out of desperation, I move from one poverty-induced activity to another poverty-induced activity because I cannot afford to stay unemployed. Okay. That's the kind of story we built from the household panel data for the urban areas. What to Mukta's question, when I was talking about flexibility, basically I was trying to talk about the occupational flexibility so that people will be able to move from one industry to another, would be able to adjust quickly to the skill requirements. That is the point. And when it comes to contractual and skilled, there the labor turnover cost also we have to see. But why the employers do not want to make investment on the contractual workers? First of all, they know that these people are not going to stay with us. And we have recruited them from through the contractors. So why to spend money on that?
But that is an endogenous decision, right?
Fine. If you say that they could have employed them on regular basis and they could have invested, the huge remuneration and the retirement benefits, accident benefits, etc., that is going to raise the labor cost. So they are in an attempt, desperate attempt to reduce the labor cost. Calculate the labor cost for different groups of industries, 63 groups of 3-digit level industries. It has sort of been reduced massively from what used to be 40%, 45%, 35%. Now you will not be able to identify any major industry where it is more than 20%. So the labor, that is the main objective of the employers now, that reduce the labor cost. So contractualization is basically a process through which they are able to reduce the labor cost. And now additionally, they know that this is the sort of 100 units or 100 man, 100 human beings we are able to employ, but with no steadiness. Tomorrow I may find another set of 100 workers. So we were posing this question. In fact, at Institute of Economic Growth also, we were debating on this issue, that why can't we recruit the temporary workers, the contractual workers on temporary basis directly, so that you don't have to pay that money to the middleman. Okay. So that way they would benefit, even if they do not have the regular, do not have the retirement benefits, etc. Why can't we recruit them directly? So here, most of the employers try to argue that it would be a very, very unpredictable situation. What is the guarantee that same 20 people will come back tomorrow? Suppose they don't. Whereas if you are employing them through the contractor, you have the guarantee that every day you will be able to get 100 human faces. So therefore, there is a kind of a complex situation there. Now, coming to this aggregate employment thing, which you said that now that they are processing the byproducts and they are pursuing diversification, employment levels have gone up. Whereas otherwise it could have gone to the informal sector. See, in the informal sector, if one job is gone, they cannot afford to stay unemployed. They will pick up definitely something or the other. So you can say that there is a deterioration in the quality of employment in the informal sector. Those who were engaged in unorganized manufacturing activities perhaps now been thrown into the space of unorganized services activities. And the evidence shows that unorganized services, unorganized transport, trade, that is on the rise. The informal sector, and as you know, Shugata Majid and other people have been arguing on this point, that many people choose to remain small so that they don't have to pay taxes, so that they don't have to pay the registration cost, etc. But that is applicable only to a thin segment, 1%, 2%. Even the government also feels that they are making a lot of money. So if we ask them to reduce the cash transactions, you will be able to detect that's applicable only to a very, very small percentage. Otherwise, retail trade, petty trade, rather, marginal activities, that is what is on the rise. And particularly after COVID, this the informal activities, the low productivity informal activities in the service sector. That is on the rise.
Not a very
Yeah.
pleasant picture.
Absolutely.
And
And yet at the, I mean,
And,
you try to keep a very hopeful tone through your presentation
Mm.
by saying that if you do X, Y, Z things, then there is something to be gained, which I suppose the right way to look at it. So there is some sort of
absolutely.
path or direction, at least in terms of supporting industry or supporting the kind of industry that.
And all of this is additionally worse for certain castes and for certain gender.
And regionals. And that is why we have been talking about this in urban counterpart of NREGA. That why can't we have a employment guarantee program for the urban areas?
Which hopefully we'll have to have another session. On that note, thank you very much for patiently answering many of our questions, and I think it's an ongoing conversation for which we will connect with you separately. Especially personally, my interest is on the overlaps with migration, and that little thing you put in there about barriers to migration, and combined with your last comment about low paying service sector growing, it's something that probably
Yes.
an intersection that needs to be looked into further. So we'll get back to it offline, and thank you very much, and thank you everyone on Zoom for sticking around, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.